Free agency is a month away for the Cincinnati Bengals, but before all of that madness begins, there's an important lesson that they can learn from 2024, and in this video, I'll explain how they can avoid falling for those same traps again. Hi again, Bengals fans. John Sheeran of A to Z Sports Cincinnati here, and I'm recording this on the day of the Super Bowl, so I got to represent with my version of the Rob Lowe NFL hat. But it is now the offseason for all 32 teams, and first on the docket is going to be free agency, and I want to cover all the bases of free agency for the Bengals before we get into some draft prospects and some draft coverage, because in recent years, the Bengals have done a pretty decent job of setting themselves up for the draft through their work in free agency. I think there are some things that they could do a little bit better at. Like, I don't think they should be pigeonholing themselves into certain positions in the early rounds just because of what they did in free agency, but that's beside the point. I think for the most part, they've done a decent job over these past 5 years with identifying proper free agency targets and really just utilizing what free agency should be for, which is to find value signings for players who have yet to play their best football. And the Bengals don't take that big of risks in free agency either, not only just with players that they go after, but the contracts that they give out, right? There's not a lot of contracts that the Bengals end up agreeing to where they're really just trapped for several years behind guaranteed money and they just have to live with bad players on the team. Like, for the most part, they can get out of pretty much any contract that they sign after a year or two. But in the short term, that still doesn't help out if you end up targeting players that just don't fit your team and just aren't really that good in general. And that was a major problem that the Bengals roster dealt with this past season, as there were some decisions that they made in free agency this time last year that really did set the roster back. And again, none of those decisions are necessarily going to hurt them this year going forward as they can get out of those contracts, but I think the real good news is that there's a very easy lesson to learn here about these mistakes. Very simply, fit with the team, whether it's the roster, the scheme, the coaches, whatever the case. Fit with the team matters a hell of a lot more, infinitely more, I should say, than how they played against the Bengals in recent years, because that seemed to be somewhat of a priority this time last year. The Bengals' two biggest whiffs in free agency last year were Geno Stone and Sheldon Rankins, and each of them had their best games of the 2023 season against the Bengals. Like, Stone had 7 interceptions in 2023. He led the league in that category, but the most impressive one that he had was against Joe Burrow back in week 2 of that season, where he fooled him in the post-snap phase. It was arguably the most impressive play that he's ever made, and he fooled a guy that doesn't normally get fooled in that situation. As for Rankins, he had 6 sacks in 2023. 3 of them came against the Bengals and against Alex Kappa. Like, Rankins absolutely dominated the Bengals in the heart of the 2023 season, and it left such an impression that the Bengals decided to target him instead of giving that money to DJ Reader. And at the time, both players did seem to make sense for what the Bengals needed on their defense. Stone looked to be a true free safety that could replace who Jesse Bates was for this defense. You could just plop him in to a cover one shell and he could just go to work there. And Sheldon Rankins on the surface looked like a penetrating pass rushing 3 technique that the Bengals didn't have on the roster. But as we all saw when they were on the field for the Bengals, they couldn't fill those roles. They weren't exactly those types of players. Because when Geno Stone was in Baltimore under Mike McDonald's defense, he wasn't a free safety. He was more of a half-field safety when they ran a bunch of cover 2. And looking at where Sheldon Rankins played on the Bengals defensive line compared to where he played on the Texans defensive line, he was in different technique spots as well, and he wasn't exactly doing the same thing that he was doing the year prior. So you had 2 guys that dominated in their previous roles against the Bengals, and, maybe against some lesser competition considering what Rankins went up against for the Bengals offensive line. But when you put them on the Bengals roster and ask them to do slightly different things, they're not the same players, which is not that surprising. And I know the Bengals had some interest in Rankins in previous years, but they couldn't land him in free agency. But again, if you're not going to use him in ways that he's been successful in years past, what's the point? But you know where they didn't make a mistake here? Mike Gesicki, which is why he's being lumped in with T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, and Trey Hendrickson as priorities for Joe Burrow to bring back this year. The Bengals saw exactly who Mike Gesicki had always been with a decent quarterback at his disposal. A big slot receiver who could sometimes line up on the outside as a wide receiver and just have a phenomenal catch radius to be a great ancillary option in this offense. And wouldn't you know, that's exactly what transpired. Had Gesicki played against the Bengals before? Yeah, a handful of times when the team wasn't very good in 2018, 2019, and 2020. The last game that he played against them was in 2022, and in that game, he had 2 receptions for 23 yards. He proved to be a good signing, not only because he was a good player, but because he fit with what the team wanted him to do. And he did it while basically making pennies compared to other tight ends, which is not going to be the case for him this upcoming season. And this lesson goes for us as well. If there is a player that the Bengals could target in free agency, and he happened to play well against them this past season, we have to look at the entire picture here. We have to take into account the context. Who is he going up against? What was his role? Is that role going to be the same on this team with this coaching staff? All of that matters. It's going to become harder and harder for the Bengals to maximize what they can do in free agency when they're going to have albatross contracts on the books aside from just Joe Burrow. They have to be smart with their money. They have to go after the players that fit them best, not just who impressed them the most in the previous year. But I can't wait to break down some of the best fits for the Bengals in free agency. But before we do all that, this lesson needs to be learned, and it needs to be learned right now.